if you are tuning in from part one, I'm picking up where we left off. We appliqued the diaper kit. We've got it adhered to pole. If you did not watch the applique video and you have no interest in applique, I'm just showing you how to construct a diaper from here on out. So we are treating this backing piece of pole that we have and this red piece of pole that we have as one fabric. If you have no interest in applique and you're just using one piece of pole, a print pole or something, then ignore having two pieces. You don't need two pieces, just keep going with your one. So what we're going to do first is something I did not do in the applique video. I talked about it briefly, but I did not go into detail. So it might be a little bit redundant, but I'm just going to talk about diaper patterns really quick. If you're new to this and you don't want to invest a lot of money into finding a pattern, I would recommend starting at Arfie's blog. If you try those and you're happy with that and you want to move on to what's next, I would then either recommend Rocket Bottoms, which was formerly owned by Krista Tracy, but it's now owned by Nature's Fabrics. So if you go to naturesfabrics.com, they've got a lot of cloth diaper pattern options there, and those are really good patterns to use. I really like them. And then the other option I would recommend is the Opulent Monsters Magnum Opus. That's an awesome pattern. It's my second favorite after mine, of course. The all-in-one is very, it's difficult. It's more of an advanced diaper sewing pattern. But don't let that scare you away, because you can still use the Magnum Opus for any other kind of diaper. I've used it for covers, I've used it for all-in-twos, I've used it for pocket diapers. You can use it for anything. So if you're intimidated by Crystal's all-in-one, don't worry about it. You can use it for any other kind of diaper. It's a really solid, really good pattern. So my pattern is my own. It's not one you'll be able to find anywhere online. So I'm going to move forward with my own pattern. So you might notice some differences between the way mine looks and the one you have looks, and that's fine. It's all the same concept. So you have your diaper cut or your yardage or whatever it is that you have. And for the people tuning in from the embroidery video, make sure you're lining up your top marking that we marked earlier with the top of your diaper. Make sure the center lines line up. If you are not tuning in from the embroidery video, just ignore all that crazy stuff I was talking about just now. So what we're going to do, cut your diaper out. I am cheap, so I use random objects that are within reach to weigh down my diapers, or my pattern. Every pattern. If you have pattern weights, or even like canned food, I've seen a lot of people use, that works so much better, but I roll with it. It's cool. So now go around. I'm sorry if you're getting a screen full of my crazy hair and my sexy baggy shirts. I've got everything marked. So you can see, well, maybe you can't, but I can see all my snap markings, and then we're just going to go ahead and cut it out. So I'm going to line up my pattern on here. Same concept as when you're cutting out your outer, you're cutting out your inner. The only difference is you don't have to mark your snaps. You can mark your elastic if you want. I don't. The only thing, because for this video I'm going to make an all-in-two. That's my most popular kind of diaper. The only thing I will mark as far as snaps are my back snaps. So if you buy a diaper pattern, it's very likely going to have snaps back here, either two or just one in the center. That's what it looks like. if you can see that. I think it looks pretty good in my view, so I'm hoping you can see that. So I just have my outer. I don't have any markings for any snaps here, just my 2 in the back. Okay, so this is my trusty little inner with my 2 snap marking points. And so I'm going to show you the next piece that we're cutting, and here's an example. We're going to cut a pole flap. This is optional. What this does is it keeps the insert from poking out of the top of the diaper right here, so if it's saturated and it's wet, it doesn't get on the baby's clothes or anything that they're holding. So we're going to do that. Like I said, it's totally optional. If you want to skip it, feel free to skip it. Some people actually prefer it without, so it's just a personal preference. And there's a little bit of measurements needed in this spot, so I'm just going to try to do my best to explain them, but I can't math, so I'm going to say a lot of stupid stuff right now. Just try to bear with me. This is my template that I cut my pull strip to, and the way I got that measurement for the template was to measure all the way across here, which came out to 11 inches on the dot, and then measure down here, which I already know off the top of my head this is 3.25 inches from the top of my pattern to this bottom point of my pattern where my strip would lay across. So my template is 3.5 inches long, because my inseam I'm going to use is going to be a quarter of an inch to 1/2 inch to fold this under, and then fold this under and then hem it. So again, this is 11 inches by 3.5 inches for me. So for you, you're gonna measure across here and measure across here, and then add a seam allowance to the bottom. Add a seam allowance to the bottom, about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, whatever. So yeah, crude rectangle to the size of your pull strip if you feel like doing that. If you don't, that's fine. Okay, so the next part we're moving on to is my personal favorite. I'm just kidding, this part is horrible and I hate doing it, and I wish I had the money to hire somebody to do it for me. But don't let that scare you. Is snapping. This, in my opinion, is the most tedious part. If you can get through it, you are in good shape. Again, as I've already said, we're doing this the way I do it. Lots of people do it different ways. I'm not saying my way is the best way in any way, shape, or form. But this is just the way I do it. It's the way I know how. I know there are some people that don't mark their snaps, and then they just go through. So they have a blank front and they go through with like a plastic template and they pop the holes in them. That's one way to do it, but I'm going to do it this way because I don't have a plastic template. So mine may look a little different than the way other people do it. And again, I know I've said this multiple times and you're probably tired of hearing it. If you are using one piece of fabric and you did not have any interest in the applique, you are going to have to do something just a little bit different. For those of us that are doing the applique, we already have 2 pieces of fabric. So we have our red pull, we have our white pull. That's enough to properly back our snaps. But if you just have one piece of pull, you need a backing. If you don't have a backing on them, your snaps are going to pull on the fabric because you don't have enough of a this is mom brain, okay? Like a stabilizer.
Can I just have one piece of paper?
Can you go ask your daddy, please? Thank you. The dire need for paper. So you're not gonna have, it's not gonna be stable enough if you only have one piece of pull. You need to back it with something. So your options are to either cut like little squares of pull and pop them through each snap and put them on the back, which I don't like doing, or you can cut one big square of pull and put it on the back and pop all the snaps through that. And you can stabilize your snaps with that. but you have to have a backing of some sort. You can't just do one layer. It's not heavy enough. So make sure you have something backing your snaps. Another layer of pull is perfect. So those of you doing the applique, you've already got that. We're gonna just poke a hole in each one of these. And maybe you can begin to understand why this task is so arduous. So your next step is going to be to put all the snaps on. I've chosen to work with yellow and orange, and in case you're interested, my yellow is B7, my orange is B55, and these are all from Cam Snaps. They're the only snaps I've used. I've never used any other brand. I've never used Dritz, I've never used Babyville. I'm very happy with Cam Snaps. So the way I do my snaps is a little different than some other people, and some other people do them exactly the same way I do. This kind of snap where it goes in, this is called a socket. So I'm using a press. If you've just started doing diapers, you probably don't have a press. You probably have a pair of pliers that look something like this. You can get the same effect using those. I just like a press because I know that I didn't mess up with a press. With pliers, you squeeze really hard and you hope it's good enough, but sometimes it may not be. With a press, it's hard enough, trust me. So that's what a socket looks like. This is what we refer to as a socket. These are size 20 Cam Snaps. This is a socket. So where I vary from some other people is that my next snap, well, I mean after I complete this whole top row of sockets, and I'm just showing you now just because it makes sense. My second row, I don't do sockets. I do studs. Studs, same thing. This is what a stud looks like. So this is what we refer to when we say it's a stud. So I do this for a number of reasons. One, if you're only doing sockets, you will use twice as many sockets as you will studs. If you do a socket and a stud, you're using very, very close to the same amount. It still varies by, I think, one snap in the end. You use one more socket than you do studs, as opposed to twice as many sockets as studs. So it's a lot easier to keep your inventory similar when you use a variation of the two. Another cool reason, and this is probably something you do more on the wing of the diaper, but I'm just going to show you now. A lot of people choose to line dry their diapers, and if you have two snaps right here that can be snapped together, they put it on their line and they can just snap it like that and hang it up. So it's easier for people that choose to line dry. So what do I do now, and I won't bore you with showing you, is I'm going to finish this top row in sockets. I'm going to finish this second row in studs, and if you want, you can do both in sockets, you can do both in studs, but I would just probably advise to keep in mind that if you do this top row in studs, if you got a chunky belly, it's going to roll in towards the baby and poke them. So this is why I like to do sockets on the top, and that is something that Miss Wiggle Biscuits Amy actually taught me. So it's very, very smart, very clever. Try to do sockets on the top if you can. Otherwise, doing all sockets is totally fine. So I'm going to snap this and I'll come back and I'll show you what I do with the rise snaps, because I also do something a little bit different there as well. Now I've got all my pretty little snaps on, sockets on top, studs on bottom, and I had mentioned I do my rise a little differently than most people do, so I'm going to show you what I do with that. Typically, and I wish I had an example, but I don't, I only have my own diapers that I've sewn. I don't have any like mainstream brands, so I can't really explain it, so I hope that you can visualize what I'm saying. A lot of brands will do stud, 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 socket, 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 socket. The problem you run into with this, same with the top, is you're using 3 studs and 6 sockets. So again, that's twice as many sockets as you're using studs. I switched that up, and this part's probably going to be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to show you how I do it. You can do it the traditional way if you prefer, and I'm just going to try to show you what I do before I dive into it. I will use a stud here, so a pokey outie, stud here, then a socket socket, then a stud stud, socket, stud, socket socket. So I mix it up. So this middle row is the only one that's different. I put the studs down here. The reason I put the studs on the bottom two in the middle row is because chubby thighs. I think about those chubby babies all the time. If this rolls in and you have your studs on this outer part, you're going to poke their fat little legs. I know this because I had fat leg babies, and if a diaper was set up that way, they always got little marks on their legs from the snaps. So if these are sockets, that's going to be way less irritating to chubby thighs. If they're studs, that's not enjoyable for anybody. So I'll snap these and I'll bring you back to see what they look like, and you can get kind of a general idea of what I meant by all the stud, socket, stud, socket, 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 stud. Okay, so now I have my rise snaps done, and here's kind of just an example to give you a better idea of all that hullabaloo I was spouting earlier about sockets and studs and just all that stuff that doesn't make sense. So stud, two sockets, these two can snap into this one, socket, two studs, these two snap into that one, stud, two sockets. So now you've used, like I had said in the beginning, when I started doing the snaps, you only used one more socket than you did studs. So now you're much closer to having the same amount of snaps than you would have been if you do it the traditional way. But again, it doesn't hurt to do it the other way. You just end up using more sockets than studs. It doesn't hurt anybody. So that is what that looks like if you choose to do it that way.
My name is Nathan because I have my Transformers. So, but I will play Hello Nathan. No, go or how is that?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I am going to start off with a walking foot. What a walking foot does is it mimics feed dogs, and these feed dogs are this part right here on the bottom that move your fabric through. So this is what a walking foot looks like. This is the one that came with my machine, and I have a Brother CS6000i. It's a very popular machine. It's a really good sewing machine if you're looking into getting something. A lot of people have it. So you can kind of see as the presser foot goes up and down, it adjusts this right here and allows fabric to feed through. So something super sticky, like the back of pole, goes through really well when you are using a walking foot. If you have the option, have your needle in the centermost position. Now it's going to vary depending on the diaper pattern you're using, but with mine I have a 3/8 inch seam allowance, so you should be able to tell based on these guides here where exactly your seam allowance is going to fall. For me, 3/8 of an inch is perfectly just at the edge of my walking foot. So I have all my pattern pieces here. I'm going to start with that pull strip. I'm going to go back here just because I can't get the whole thing in the shot. That pull strip we cut out. Can you see that? And I'm going to work on hemming it. You can see roughly what I've got going on here, about like that. If you want to be precise, feel free to measure it. I've just been doing it for a while, so I don't have any problem just kind of winging it as I go. I use a stitch length of 3. I don't know if it varies from machine to machine, but I use a 3, and that's just one notch up from the standard 2.5 that my machine is set to. And I use a 3/8 inch seam allowance on this. And then I just straight stitch all the way across. So that's my back, that's my front. So you just have this hemmed little pull strip now. It's beautiful. If you are sewing and you need to adhere your tags, I've got one around here somewhere. This is the best spot to do it. I put it about 2 inches away from the edge, and then I change my stitch length to a full baste, which is the longest stitch length that you have available. When you baste something, it's much simpler to rip the stitches out. When you are ready to, if you need to, if you used the standard 2.5 that's on my machine at least, it would be much harder to rip the stitches out if you needed to. So now you have your tag on there, and this is done. You're ready to use your pretty little pull strip. So now I'm going to show you how I quote unquote pin it together, because, you know, I'm using these clips, I'm not actually pinning anything. So I have my outer fabric here, and I'm going to take my pull strip that we just made, and I'm going to not do this wrong. I'm going to lay this right sides together and line the top corners up and pin all the way around. Or clip, I guess, would be correct. I'm sorry if I keep sticking my face in here. I'm just trying to make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. I went back and watched the applique video before doing this, and I realized there were like 8,000 times where I said, "Can you guys see what I'm doing?" And I didn't realize that our camera was high def, so not only could you see what I was doing, but like you could count the hairs on my arms. It's horrible, but I don't really care, so we're just gonna roll with it. So I've got that pinned. This is about what that's gonna look like. Next, you're gonna take your inner fabric, and you are gonna do the same thing. You're gonna pin it around this. Okay, so I am placing my last clip here. I didn't think that it was important that you guys saw me pin this together. In just a brief recap of the order we did everything in. It's our outer layer, face up, our pull strip, face down, so you have the shiny side of the pull facing you, and then our inner layer, face down. Considering I'm making an all-in-2, I need to leave an opening to turn my diaper right side out through. So if you're doing a pocket diaper, you would just use the pocket, so you sew all the way around the whole thing. But I'm doing an all-in-2, so I don't have a pocket opening, and I need to leave a gap. For me, I do it at the 4th snap. This is probably about 4.5 inches into my diaper. This is where I start sewing. So whenever you start, make sure you set your machine back to a standard stitch length. You're not still on a baste. You're going to want to start and then back tack and keep going. So similar to where I started, I'm going to stop about 3 inches away, so at this first snap right here. Back tack. So your next step is going to be trimming off your seam allowance. Now, this is another thing that's a personal preference, and the jury is out on this one. Some people say trim as close as you can get to that stitch line without cutting it. I totally disagree. I will trim about half of this off. So about a 1/4 inch or so, and you'll go around the whole diaper doing that. I am using pinking shears. It's not a necessity. I just found I like the appearance of the seam when it's top stitched more if I'm using pinking shears. Once you have all your seams cut or pinked or whatever you choose to do, you'll just clip your corners. So I haven't finished cutting yet, but so anytime you have a corner, so this is a wing right here, so you're going to do this along the wing, and you're also going to do this along the tummy panel where there's points. You want to clip them at a 45-degree angle. So that just allows that point to actually point out. If you left all that bulk there when you turned it right side out, you just kind of have a lump instead of a point. So this is going to help you get that point. And if you have a hard time getting a point still, you could even take a little more off and kind of angle it. Try just trimming it once for starters and see how that goes. So once you have your seam allowance trimmed, it should look something like this. It's not going to look a lot like this. You probably aren't using pinking shears. Make sure you do not trim your seam allowance where your turning hole is. You need this added seam allowance right here to tuck your raw edges in and get a finished edge. So what you're going to do now is just turn the whole thing right side out through this hole. It's going to be a little confusing because you're going to look at this and you're going to see, you know, your backing fabric, then the fabric that you used for the front of your diaper. I mean, this is assuming you're doing the applique. If you only have one piece of pull, you're not going to see that. Then your pull strip and your inner. So you actually have 4 layers here if you did an applique. If you didn't do an applique, you have 3. Where you want to turn is between your pull strip and your outer layer. So for me, that's right here. And especially if you've done embroidery, you're going to have some bulk when you're turning. So just go really gentle through that turning hole. You don't want to pop any stitches right there. So you're kind of going to have a diaper now. You're starting to see it take shape and form. I'm sorry if I'm being like totally redundant or not making sense. I took a melatonin and it kicked in really fast. So what you're going to want to do now is find all your corners and start to wiggle them out. See if you can get a point out of them. So that's not quite what we want. So you can just try to like massage it out with your fingers. Another good idea is a blunt tip tool. So I have the stylus for my embroidery machine, and sometimes I just kind of cram that in there and work the corners out as necessary. I don't personally think it's a huge deal if they're not perfectly sharp. That being said, if you're selling, you obviously want to try to get the most aesthetically pleasing corner you can, so that's probably about as good as it's going to get for me, and I'm happy with that. That's totally fine. So you want to go through and work out every corner. One way to get pretty elastic casings is to clip them before you start to sew your elastic casing. I am doing this method of elastic installation with a casing. Some people like to sew it down in the seam allowance, their elastic down in the seam allowance, or pre-measure or stuff like that, and I don't do that at all. I have 155 yards of elastic on a roll, and I don't ever measure it. I don't think I've ever measured elastic for a diaper. So I'll show you how I do that. So we're going to do a casing my way. So try to get no extra bulk. Make sure it's nice and flat. When you go to pin it, I'm just going to call it pin because clip sounds like you're wanting to cut it. So when you pin it, try to get it flat. What I mean by flat is that there's, like, I guess kind of no added bulk here, because if you have this rolled out or this rolled under too much, then you're just going to get this weird pucker toward the wrong side. So just try to get it as evenly dispersed as possible. And if you have embroidery, so you have a extra backing layer of pull, it's going to be thicker, and so it's going to give the appearance of a thicker elastic. I guess it'll be more fluffy and less ruffly. I don't know. Is that a decent word choice? I blame the melatonin, you guys. My brain's, it's like what right now? Probably should have waited to do this till tomorrow, but being a trooper. So pin everywhere you're going to put the elastic, from elastic point to elastic point. Pin slash clip along the whole length. So now I've pinned the length of my elastic in all spots, and this is totally optional, but I've chosen to do it because I've noticed since I've started doing it, my elastics are just prettier in general than they were without doing it. It just makes sure that my seam stays nice and flat and pretty. So this is where things might be different for me than they are for you. At this point, I take my walking foot off. It's no longer needed. And what I do next is bump the camera several times. These are my next 2 feet I'm going to use. This is just a standard straight stitch zigzag foot. The other tool I use that you may not have to use is a zipper foot. I probably should have shown you what that was. I have a detachable foot and ankle, so I can just pop that off and put my zipper foot on there. Your machine might be different, especially if you have an older machine. So like I said, you may not need to use the zipper foot. I do, because right here between this snap and the edge of this fabric, I have to get my elastic casing right in there. And if I have a regular foot on, I don't have enough room to do that. So with a zipper foot, I can get by that really easy. So you can use a zipper foot even if you have a larger gap right here, or you don't go up to your snaps. You can still use a zipper foot. But if you don't need to use a zipper foot to get past a snap, I wouldn't even bother. It's just time consuming to swap your feet off and on. So I'm going to continue with my zipper foot, and I only use this for a minute, and then I'll switch back to my straight stitch zigzag combo foot. I always go the wrong way at first. So here we are. Because we're doing an elastic casing, we got to make sure our casing is wider than our elastic. And this is the elastic I use. You're going to want 3/8 inch braided elastic. I buy elastic in bulk from CTS USA, I think. I'll have to double check that for you. And it's the best elastic I've ever used. A lot of people recommend Stretch Right. I do not like Stretch Right. I found, and this is going to sound funny, but I found Stretch Right elastic to be too stretchy. So when I was threading it, it liked to like buckle in on itself, and it would overstretch, and it just looked bad, in my opinion. But this is a relatively thick elastic. Meh. You can kind of tell there. So it doesn't buckle in on itself like the Stretch Right stuff did. So this is 3/8 inch elastic. So as you could imagine, I want my casing to be wider than 3/8 inch. So I go with, again, a 5/8 inch. And for me, what that is, it's gonna probably vary for you, is putting my needle in the leftmost position and lining it up with the edge of my zipper foot. So again, that's gonna vary a lot. Hang on, we're getting there. So you can kind of see where the edge of my fabric is right there. Right there. So that's gonna vary a lot from, what did I do? From person to person. Oh, I zoomed way in. From person to person, pattern to pattern, where exactly your seam allowance is going to fall for something like this. I would say do 5/8 of an inch is kind of like the perfect measurement. Much less, and you're not going to get a wide enough casing. Much more, and you're going to get too baggy of a casing. It's just not going to look pretty. So you're going to do the same thing we did when we were sewing our diaper, and that's go forward, go back, go forward. You're going to tack it down. So this is what I was telling you about earlier. As you can see, I really don't have a lot of room for this foot to fit by this needle. So if I was using a regular foot right now, it would not happen. They would get caught on each other and it would be a nasty mess and I'd be angry. So with my zipper foot, I can easily get past that. So if you have the same issue with the pattern you're using, strap on a zipper foot and it'll go right by. You won't have an issue with that. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is to try to just make sure your inner fabric stays under. If it starts to roll out, this is exaggerated, but if it starts to roll out like this, you don't want to stitch over that. So just make sure it stays tucked under nicely. Now I've switched to my other side of the leg elastic. And so that's all I use my zipper foot for. Now I'm going to take it off. And I don't need it again. So I'm going to put my regular foot back on. And now I'm going to do my back elastic. Casing, not elastic, I'm not there yet. My back elastic casing. using the same seam allowance. Nothing's changed. So now you've got casing there, the casing on each leg. And I'm cheap, so most people have something called a bodkin that they put on the end of their elastic so they can pull it through their casings. I put a snip in mine and use a bobby pin because every couple months I have to buy like 1,000 of them and they just go missing in random places in my house. So I just put it on a bobby pin and do it that way, I guess. So I'll show you my method for this, and like I said, I never measure elastic. So that turning hole that we used earlier, you're gonna put your elastic in there and you're gonna feel your way over to that casing and you're just gonna start threading your elastic down in there. And I don't know if you can see my bobby pin going in. I just pulled it back out. Hang on. And then just sort of start working it through like this, inching along. Until you finally get out of that casing, and I'll just like pull it all the way to the wing and hold on to it so it stays out of my way. So now I've got, I mean you can't tell, so just take my word for it, I have my elastic threaded all the way through. My bobby pin is right here, and this is where my stitch is going to be. So I make sure they're really far away from each other because I've actually like sewn over bobby pins before and it's just annoying to try to fix. So make sure they're far away from each other. And you're going to go to that elastic marking again and you're going to back tack. So I go 3 passes, once over, once back, once over again. So what I do at this point, it's really hard for me to explain to people, so I'm just going to do my best here, is I grab my elastic and I just pull it as tight as I can. You're not going to tack it down as tight as you can, but I pull it as tight as I can get it to go. And then I hold on to my untacked elastic point. And see, so I have this ugly ruffle going on like this. That's not cute. We don't like that. And I slowly start to pull and let out my elastic while still pulling it tight. And I get to this point where I have my leg completely relaxed, like there's no elastic, and that's the length I want my elastic to be. So I'm still pinching it with my thumb over here. I haven't let go. So now once I loosen this hand, it gathers, and that's the exact point I want my elastic to be at. That's the perfect length. It's a little tricky. It's just always how I've done mine. So you want to try to keep it nice and taut. And do the same thing. Forward, backward, forward, tack it down. So now you'll have something like this, and that's so pretty. And we're gonna do that exact same thing on all 3 sides. So once you have all 3 elastics installed, this is roughly what you're gonna be left with. And that looks a heck of a lot like a diaper, wouldn't you say? So what we're gonna do now, and this is pretty much the last step as far as sewing goes. And again, this is an optional step, but Same with pinning the elastic casing. I found that once I started pinning the diaper before I top stitched it, I started getting a more aesthetically pleasing appearance. So I'm going to show you this right here really quick. If you are a business owner and you installed the tag, there is that base stitch we put the tag on with. So we're very happy we did a baste, because we do have to rip it out, and I actually most of the time, probably like 90% of the time, I don't have to rip those out. They get caught in my seam allowance, but this time it did not, and that's good for a video. So I'll take a seam ripper or my trusty snips that I keep telling you about that you should go buy, and I'll just pop this out. Before you cut this out though, you want to make sure your tag is caught in your seam allowance. I just know mine is, based on how far it is away from my seam. I know it's caught in there. So before you rip this out, you're just going to want to double check that it did get caught in your seam allowance and you're not ripping out the basting thread that was holding it in place. So now you've pretty much pinned around the whole thing except for your turning hole right here. And so I try not to finagle with it. Like, I don't tuck it in and try and make it look pretty. I just kind of leave it alone and just push on it a little bit. And it will usually find a flat, even plane across the top to close it up. So you shouldn't have to adjust it too much to look cohesive with the rest of your diaper. It should more or less close up pretty much evenly with everything else. So you're going to go ahead and top stitch all the way around the front of your diaper, and then top stitch all the way around the wings. Always remember to tack it down backward, forwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. Let me show you another trade secret here. This is a scrap of pole. I've folded it up on itself 4 times and just stitched a crude rectangle out of it. And what this does is I put this under my foot, and this creates bulk behind the foot, lifting it up off the machine. If this wasn't here and I tried to go forward right now, because there's a bunch of bulk right here, it would probably put like 10 to 15 stitches in one spot, and I don't like that. So when I put this behind it and it creates bulk under my foot, it just glides straight across like there was never even bulk there to begin with. So you can use that at every corner that you're going to have some extra bulk to get over. And always backstitch when you're stopping as well. So I don't know how well you'll be able to see the stitches in my corner here. Right there. So without that little, whatever we want to call this thing, without that, you would probably see a bunch. See how there's like one small stitch in there? There'd probably be like 5 or 10 needle holes slowly building up to longer stitches. So when it has bulk like that, it has a really hard time getting going again. But if I'm using my little homemade hump jumper there, it just goes straight back into it. So it's definitely a more aesthetically pleasing approach to turning corners with a lot of bulk. So you're gonna do your wings next. So unless you have like a business tag you want to add, this is going to be your last step as far as sewing goes. I would recommend putting outside like woven tags on before you do the snaps, because then the snaps could potentially interfere with your foot and that's just irritating. So your next step is going to be any leftover snaps that you have to put on. So I have to put my wing snaps on here, but if you did your tummy panel snaps the way I do, make sure you're putting the correct wing snaps on. So my top one needs to be a stud to go into the socket, and my bottom one needs to be a socket to go into the stud. To make things more confusing for you, I have crossover snaps, so my crossover snaps need to match the tummy snaps, because I want my wing to be able to snap into the crossover snaps if need be. So just make sure, just be really careful if you did them my way to make sure that they're actually going to work together. You don't want to do them backwards. So once you've got your wing snaps on, there it is. You did it. You're finished. So that's what that looks like with the 1 3/4 inches we used in the very first video. And that's a really good distance from your elastic right there. So very cute. You can always put an insert in it to get kind of just a better look. I like to put inserts in them for my pictures, and it fluffens them up a little bit. So without an insert, it's a little flat, but it's still cute. So there it is. And that is how you make a cloth diaper with pull, still water resistant, with full embroidery.